But here we are, my 8th lecture that I titled, Who's America? Protest and Reform. Now, thus far, I've gotten us from the creation of the nation through the onset of some new feelings about American democracy and a democratic politics and how those things should function. That was Andrew Jackson on Tuesday. And we saw on Tuesday how Jackson positioned himself as a champion of the common white man, and that the rise of that kind of power and sentiment was accompanied by rights being stripped away from other peoples. And I talked about the Indian Removal Act, and I talked about his views about Native Americans. So in essence, we saw the political implications of an ongoing struggle over democracy in Jackson's time. Today, I want to broaden my lens, and I want to look at some broader changes going on in the 1820s, 1830s, and a little bit of the 1840s, because these were decades of tremendous change in the United States. As we'll see today, and actually as you've been reading in de Tocqueville's Democracy in America, the United States in this period was a hive of activity and risings and fallings and struggles and protests and opportunities and losses. Some of that flows through what we're reading for this week, and that's some of what I'm going to be talking about today. That activity, all of that searching and struggling, is going to be at the heart of today's lecture. So, for example, you had things in this period like the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution and manufacturing. Related to that, you had a series of financial panics in the early 19th century. You had the first great wave of immigration. You had the rise of organized reform movements fighting for things like temperance or against things like slavery. You had the start of new technologies like railroads and the telegraph that were crisscrossing and connecting the nation as never before. And you had one particular mood of response to all of this change and probably at various points seeming chaos. You had people looking for comfort and stability amidst what felt like unrest. And for some, as I'll get to later in the lecture, for some, they sought that kind of comfort in religion. Others turned to utopian communities, which also rose in this period, these communities that seemed to offer something really different from capitalist, commercial, market-driven America. Now, before I plunge in, I want to pause for a moment to glance at how the nation was growing in this period, because it's kind of mind-boggling. And I'm going to spout some numbers here, and for the students in the class, you do not need to know these numbers. Relax with the numbers. Okay, so in 1815, there were 18 states in the Union. By 1860, there were 33. It's kind of impressive. In 1814, the United States had a population of roughly 8 million people. On the eve of the Civil War, the population had increased to roughly 31 million people, a rate of population growth roughly 33% per decade. During the 1830s, about 600,000 immigrants came to the United States, 4 times the number that came in the 1820s. And in the 1850s, that number increased from 600,000 immigrants to roughly 2.5 million immigrants arriving in the United States in that decade. That's a tremendous, take that all together, and that's amazing growth. Because of that, by 1851, the House of Representatives needed to be enlarged because they could no longer fit all of the representatives into the chamber representing these new states and this new population. So clearly the nation is growing dramatically in this period, which leads to a big question, which will be at the heart of this lecture. What did all of that change look like on the ground? What did it feel like, and what did it mean? Or more importantly and more concisely, how did all of this change shape the nation and and the democratic process? To answer that question, let's start by looking at a cluster of changes that, for the purposes of this lecture, I'm bundling up under the heading Market Revolution. And I will say, what I just described, all of that change, the two images here are meant to give you an image of that change. On the right is Lower Manhattan in, I want to say, 1797. On the left is Lower Manhattan in 1827. Look at the difference in everything in that photo. The trade, the bustle, the people. It's amazing. And this is like in a 2 or 3 block span in New York City. Okay, so the market revolution. What do I mean by the market revolution? Well, in part, I'm talking about 3 interconnected things. So first, I'm talking about a period when industry and commercial markets of all kinds were growing dramatically and becoming kind of a national infrastructure. Second, this growth of industry was linked with new modes of transportation and technology that joined the nation together in new and dramatic ways. And then third, the idea of a market revolution, as I'm discussing it here today, entailed dramatically changing economic possibilities, which led to really big changes in American society at large. So in essence, the phrase market revolution involves things that I'm bundling together that include changes in industry and manufacturing and markets, changes in the national infrastructure of transportation and communication, and then changes in mindsets of all kinds, as well as fundamental changes in society and the economy. It's a lot of changes. Now, it's important to note, as I'm talking about this in this lecture, that the changes I'll be talking about today were not contained only within these couple of decades. They didn't all happen between the 1820s and the early 1840s. Although I'm focusing on this period, the changes that I'm talking about did not poof appear and then poof disappear. Obviously, many of the things I'm talking about today have their roots in things that happened in the 18th century. And without a doubt, many of the changes that I'm talking about today will continue to other sets of lectures and even beyond the end point of this course. One last important point to note before I take this plunge, and that is, you'll see that there's a northern tilt to much of what I'm talking about today. I'll be talking more about the North than the South. This is not to say that the market revolution was a northern thing. It affected the entire nation. So, for example, it helped bolster the South as a kingdom of cotton. And the idea of the South as a kingdom of cotton was bound up with the nation's push westward and with the fate of slavery. And I suspect David Blight's going to be picking up on some of this next week when he stands up. In essence, what I'm saying is that the market revolution was a national phenomenon, but it affected different parts of the country in different ways. Okay, so to explore all of this change, let's start with a major event in the national infrastructure that had some pretty big major economic implications: the Erie Canal, built between 1817 and 1825. Now, I have to ask, the last time I taught about the Erie Canal was in a class that was only undergraduates. And when I said, who here knows the Erie Canal song? Nobody knew the Erie Canal song. Now, I grew up learning it in school, and I suspect with a multi-generational audience, how many of you know the Erie Canal song? Thank you. Thank you. You realize we're going to have to sing a line. Because I dared myself to do this in front of 800 people. Okay. Join in with me if you choose. I got a mule, her name is Sal, 15 miles on the Erie Canal. She's a good old worker and a good old pal. 15 miles on the Erie Canal. I have just accomplished my purpose in life. Thank you. Thank you very much. I was so sad when no one knew it. But see, now the students in the class, really, everyone knew this song. Okay. So now the Erie Canal was a virtual revolution in transportation, an internal improvement the likes of which the nation really had not seen before. It was a project funded by New York State, so it's state-funded and organized and accomplished. Even before it was built, people were envisioning this new canal as some kind of, enormous waterway that would fundamentally change American trade as something of a miracle. And they talked throughout this period of the Erie Canal as a kind of miracle. DeWitt Clinton, who's a major politico in New York and a major promoter of the Erie Canal, was a major source of all of this inflated, crazy pro-canal rhetoric. So, for example, Clinton declared that, quote, New York will create a new era in history and erect a work more stupendous, more magnificent, and more beneficial than has hitherto been achieved by the human race. Definitely, he's trying to get people riled up. Now, it's really easy to make fun of that kind of comment. It's definitely over the top, but there's some nugget of truth to what Clinton is saying, because just look at what the canal did. It connected part of the East and part of the West. It tied the developing West into Eastern cities and markets. Along these lines, it dramatically expanded economic markets of all kinds, and it compressed time and space in seemingly impossible ways, because you could go further, faster than you could before, and I'm going to talk more about that a little further into the lecture. The canal did a lot, and at the time, people understood how grand and amazingly ambitious a project it was. So just look at the logistics. It was designed for horse-drawn barges. It extended from the Hudson River at Albany to Lake Erie, which is 353 miles, making it 10 times longer than any existing American canal. In 1817, it added up to 3 times the entire country's canal mileage. It would have to bridge rivers and streams. It would have to pierce through a rocky ridge several miles thick, and at one point climb a nearly vertical 60-foot ridge. The projected cost of the canal was several times larger than New York State's annual budget. The mere idea of such a canal seemed crazy to many, and conveniently Thomas Jefferson registered that view by saying the Erie Canal is, quote, little short of madness. Thank you, Thomas Jefferson. So the Erie Canal seemed like an impossibly ambitious project. As a result, when it was successfully completed in 1825, Americans were quick to trumpet the grand implications, particularly focusing on what the canal suggested about America in comparison with the rest of the world. So as happy as Americans were that they survived the War of 1812, as I showed on Tuesday, Americans still had something of an inferiority complex when it came to the rest of the world. Generally speaking, European canals were shorter, and they were traveling over more settled landscapes. So focusing on these facts, Americans bragged about how wonderfully superior this American effort was to paltry European canals. As one promoter put it, and in some ways, all of these inflator quotes, they sound so inherently American, right? We're always over the top somehow through all of American history. So as one person said in response to what happened with the canal, Americans had built the longest canal in the world in the least time with the least experience. Why that's something to be proud of, I don't know. For the least money and to the greatest public benefit. It could only be accomplished by Republican, meaning people of a republic, Republican free men. This is a sign of how great we are. Now, even Jefferson ultimately was persuaded because of the building of the canal. He was happy to have been proven wrong. He declared that, and this is also very American and very Jeffersonian. In the end, he said the canal proves the, quote, moral superiority of Americans. Interesting logic, but so Jefferson went. And the canal was an immediate success. Lumber and grain and flour flowed from upstate and the old Northwest into New York City, and trade goods traveled from the city out, along with wave of migrants and immigrants traveling both ways. Merchants and bankers and shippers and warehouse owners had enormous profits. Now, it's important to note as I say all of that, I'm not just talking about a bunch of elite men wanting and building canals. Middling farmers, for example, in interior parts of the country were demanding access to lucrative markets, so accordingly, they wanted canals. The end result was a burst of internal improvement projects in the 1820s and 1830s, funded by state governments. Now, already I've hinted at some of the big changes entailed in these internal improvements. So, for example, the mobility of people increased dramatically. People were picking up and moving, seeking work, seeking profit, seeking something. And again, this is some of what you see in Tocqueville when you're reading what he is saying roughly about this time period this week. He mentions, Americans are always moving. Why are they always moving? What does it mean that they're always moving? Social mobility was also affected. Some people moved up in society, as we'll see shortly, and of course, as ever, others did not move up, but rather were kept in place or suffered at the hand of capitalistic markets. And a new middling class of professionals bloomed, accountants and clerks and managers. Also, these internal improvements produced a boom of profits, and not surprisingly, they were not equally distributed throughout society. So by 1840, the top 1% of Americans owned about 40% of the nation's wealth. Imagine that. So to quickly sum up what I've just described, internal improvements created more geographic mobility of people, more markets, more widely spreading markets, more social mobility, more financial profits. All of this is seemingly good, but these key developments were also chipping away at the yeoman farmer ideal in key ways. For example, they made farmers dependent on markets and their fluctuations. And farmers who did not successfully manage those challenges lost their land, often became tenant farmers, doing the equivalent of agricultural wage labor. And not only farmers were affected by these changes. The fact that farmers were buying more manufactured goods for use in everyday life increased the demand for such goods and drove up the prices of those goods, which encouraged some manufacturers to change their production methods. So increasingly, there's more mechanization, as in textile mills in New England. In the New England countryside, entrepreneurs built textile factories, mills, spinning cotton picked by enslaved people into cloth. And the workers were often country girls whose family needed the wages and went to the mill to earn money. But because the owners of these mills were caught up in expanding markets and were hungry for ever-increasing profits, they kept wages for workers very low. And workers often had to work ridiculous hours, like 16-hour days, to make a living wage. So you've got mechanization, you've got wage workers, suddenly their work is of a different kind. The nature of the work that these workers were doing was also changing. In the past, a shoemaker would create a pair of shoes from beginning to end. Now, women and children and poor immigrants, as well as men, worked on parts of shoes, and not necessarily in big factories, but increasingly, people were working in repetitive modes of work. They weren't building a whole shoe. They were building a part of a shoe again and again and again and again for not much pay. So this hints at something that I suggested at the start of the lecture, this idea that the market revolution had both a positive and a negative impact. It created possibilities, it opened new worlds, but it also repressed people, made them subject to the whims of the market. So even as the market revolution pushed the United States along its path from being something of an agricultural backwater to a more competitive and prosperous nation, society was really changing, and again, sometimes for the worse and not for the better. Another new form of transportation, the canal was one, that fundamentally changed the United States was the railroad. Again, not surprising. Railroads first began to be built in the 1820s and 1830s and then experienced a real boom beginning in the 1840s. But in this early period, they were largely localized operations. There was no big central control of the railroad. So by the 1840s, there were over 400 different railroad companies in the United States, little local companies. There was also no single agreed upon track width. Different railroad companies had different track widths and different schedules. It had nothing to do with any of the other companies. So because of all of this confusion, the spread of countless railroads led to the growing importance of watches and clocks. Makes sense, right? Suddenly people are like, ooh, we really need to know what time it is because there's a lot of transportation happening here and things could bang into each other. Who knows when they're coming? So scheduling ultimately created more of a focus on watches and clocks and ultimately created time zones, standardized time zones, which we take for granted. But this is where they're born of. They didn't become fully standardized until later in the 19th century, but still, our standard time zones were created by railroad executives and then formalized by the US government decades later. So technology changed the organization of time in the United States. Again, you can see how industry, work, play, even concepts of time were shaped by the railroad. Now, it's important to note these changes weren't restricted to the United States, but because the United States was so vast geographically, and because its size and its span was so big a part of the challenge of handling so many things throughout the United States, these kinds of revolutions that I'm talking about had a particularly big impact on the United States. This transportation revolution joined parts of the Union and shaped the Union in new ways. Related to this, in addition to a transportation revolution, there was a communication revolution in this period. So on the one hand, for example, things like the steam-powered printing press meant that you could really produce newspapers quickly and more plentifully, and they could be spread through some of the transportation I'm describing here more quickly than ever before. And my recent book, The Field of Blood, shows how technological advances like steam-powered printing presses and, more importantly, the telegraph fundamentally changed national politics. It was the telegraph, really, that revolutionized communication and dramatically shaped national politics. For many, even more than the Erie Canal, the telegraph was the wonder of the age. Actually, I love the fact that we are multi-generational here. You know what I remember that is related to this that will make me feel 892 years old? The first time I used a fax machine. And I couldn't understand how the paper went in my machine and came out somewhere else. It's like, wow, that's so fast, right? Which now feels like the goofiest thing in the world. But I remember standing in the Library of Congress sending my first fax and thinking, I don't understand how this works. So the telegraph was a wonder to people. It first came into use in the United States in the 1840s, thanks to the efforts of inventor Samuel Morse. And again, as with so much else in this period, the government did not start out supporting the telegraph, so it was developed through private enterprise. And not surprisingly, it was immediately seen as a vital way of nationalizing what was happening in Washington and what was happening in Congress. Things are nationalizing in the nation at large, but communicating things from the national center, from Washington and Congress, took a very long time. Thus, the fact that the first telegraph line went up between Washington, D.C. and Baltimore. In 1844, right towards its start, the telegraph was immediately used by Whigs in Washington to learn what was happening at the Whig National Convention in Baltimore heading into a presidential election, right? They're like, wait a minute, we can tell what's happening in Baltimore immediately. This is shocking. As one political observer put it, Little else is done here but watch Professor Morse's bulletin from Baltimore to learn the progress of doings at the convention. Now, not surprisingly, this kind of speedy communication really fundamentally changed national politics. Before the telegraph, there was dead time between when things happened in Congress and when the nation learned about them. During that dead time, you could control spin, you could sort of cover over mistakes. After the telegraph, not so much dead time, a lot less wiggle room. What did this mean? Well, let me offer you an example which you can feel in this anecdote I'm going to tell. People at the time realizing, whoa, the telegraph is changing things. In 1850, in the Senate, when, surprise, surprise, the fate of slavery was being debated, one senator pulled a gun on another senator. The other senator dramatically opened his vest and said, "Let the assassin fire." Ultimately, not much happened. As always happened during these kinds of fights and episodes, people jumped up on desks to see what was happening, and the gun was pulled out of the hand of the senator who had it in his hand, and everybody sat down, and they were just going to go on with business because that sort of thing happened from time to time in the antebellum Congress. But the telegraph introduced a new problem, which was immediately introduced when everyone sat down and tried to go back to work. As one senator said, and this is a bad paraphrase, "I hope you all realize, sitting here, that because of the telegraph, in 45 minutes, the entire nation will be hearing that we're slaughtering each other on the Senate floor in Washington, and there's nothing that we can do about that." And when you read this in the congressional record, you can feel the sort of, whoa, response, right? It's just changing the connection between politics in Washington and politics with the rest of the nation. So politics was truly becoming national in a sense that it hadn't been before because of the telegraph, but there's an ultimate irony here. The communications revolution unleashed by railroads and the telegraph was supposed to strengthen the Union by joining its parts. As one newspaper editor wrote in 1846, "We shall become more and more one people, thinking more alike, acting more alike, and having more one impulse." But in a nation increasingly divided by sectional conflicts, a national network that linked localities together wasn't always helpful, particularly in the decades that extend beyond my lectures. Now, it's worth considering when we think about technology and we think about American politics. Technology fundamentally shapes democracy in ways that it's really easy to overlook. Because if you think about it, democracy is a kind of conversation between political power holders and the people who give them that power. So any technology that changes that conversation fundamentally changes the nature of democracy. Just think about social media as one example of all of the ways in which that's true and all of the ways that that has changed what we see, what we expect, what we know, what we don't know. Technology fundamentally shapes democracy. Okay, so how did these changes shape living in the United States as a whole? Well, certainly cities were changing, not just with more manufacturing, but they were becoming more crowded and filled with wage laborers and drifters. Because of the increase of wage labor and changes in farming, the fundamental nature of the family changed as well. You have young women going out to work, you have young men going to cities to become clerks. So in essence, during the market revolution, there were big changes taking place that percolated down to the very center of American society. Now, it's really interesting, all of this moving and bust and boom profits and mass numbers of workers moving from city to city led to yet another phenomenon in this period, which I find really fascinating. The rise of the con man, or confidence man, right? A confidence man is someone who buys, essentially gains people's confidence and then scams them. This is the period when the idea of the con man rises. Why? Because it was very easy, given everything I've just described, for a stranger to come into a city or even a large town and bank on the fact that not everyone knew everyone anymore. There were a lot of strangers, so a con man wouldn't look so suspicious as a stranger. And they could have some kind of scam, they could grab what they could get, and then move on to another town. So the phrase confidence man actually first appeared in print in 1849. You can see the ways in which all of the things I've just mentioned were interrelated. We're talking about a network of changes and shifts and developments, all intertwined, and together they're really fundamentally changing the nature of American society and culture, as well as the economy, and even people's understanding of the Union as a whole. Which brings us to the second part of this lecture, which is, how did people respond to all of that change? If you think about it, there are a few ways in which people might respond to periods of immense change. So on the one hand, they might feel swept off their feet by all of the changes and reach out for sources of reassurance, like the comfort of religion, or the sense of control offered by reform movements. On the other hand, they might get swept up in the idea that the best way to respond to the chaos was to reach for a new living alternative like a utopian community. Both of these things were happening in the early decades of the 19th century. So let's start with the ways in which people reached for religion in this period. When it comes to religion, in a sense, the same feelings that were shaping politics, the gradual democratization of politics, were being reflected in religion as well. People wanted more direct and personal engagement with religious institutions. Increasingly, they didn't want to be preached by elite authorities on high. So in essence, in the realm of religion, Americans were reaching toward ideas that put individuals in charge of their own religious destiny. Rather than clinging to the Calvinist idea that God had arbitrarily selected some people for salvation and others for damnation, increasingly, Americans reached toward the belief that anyone could attain salvation. Salvation was a matter of individual will for anyone. So in a way, heaven, as well as politics, became democratized in this period, as some people turned against institutional religion, preached from on high, in favor of a more populist idea of religion that centered on the right to think for yourself. This burst of individualized religious sentiment and new religious groups that emerged during this period, very end of the 18th century and then into the 19th century, ultimately became known as the Second Great Awakening. Many of the leaders of these new religious groups saw themselves as preaching a new version of Christianity as compared with the old. The old version of Christianity was a tale of top-down hierarchies by religious authorities, what Thomas Jefferson would have called priestcraft, with elite clergy often wielding orthodoxy. During the Second Great Awakening, religion came to see increasingly like a matter of the heart, not a hierarchical matter of the mind. So by this new logic, people had the power to attain their own salvation. And as I've already mentioned, the search for salvation felt particularly important at this moment in time because of the ways in which Americans felt that everything was changing. Religion offered comfort and reassurance. Now, certainly it makes perfect sense that questions about individual salvation and individual religious rights were in the air at the same time that American politics were centering so frequently on questions about political rights and liberties, and the increasingly powerful ways in which the masses, American citizens, were learning to express their political voices. As one member of a new religious sect put it in this time period, and it's always nice when historical people say exactly what you want them to say. This person said, America's political regeneration is leading to a comparable ecclesiastical regeneration. So he says it right there. So what we've come to call the Second Great Awakening, this sweeping wave of a religious movement in the late 18th and early 19th century, was the result of a lot of these different elements I've been talking about. This growing sense of democratization in society generally and religion specifically, the desire for maybe a new order of society given what felt like chaos, and a desire for some kind of reassurance in the face of dramatic growth and change. Now, for a moment, let's just look at some of the details of the Second Great Awakening. What are we talking about here? Well, and actually, Connecticut, when I have been writing these lectures, I have not been searching for Connecticut and New Haven moments, I promise, but they pop up so that, the joy of discovery when you're writing a lecture is, well, look at that, it's New Haven again. So there'll be one or two moments. We're going to have a Connecticut moment here because the Second Great Awakening actually began as a series of religious revivals in Connecticut in the 1790s, slowly blazing its way across the nation over the next half century. And at first, educated Congregationalists and Presbyterians, like Yale's President Timothy Blight, played an important role in encouraging mass conversions. And there were actually mass conversions right here at Yale. But as this movement moved to frontier states like Kentucky and Tennessee, it began to change, as shown by the popularity of enormous emotion-driven camp meetings. These enormous camp meetings were essentially gigantic revivals in which sometimes members of several denominations gathered together in huge open-air camps for up to a week to hear revivalists proclaim that the second coming of Jesus was near and the time for repentance was now. Many of these frontier meetings, in the spirit of what I've been saying, were led by ordinary farmers and artisans who had experienced powerful conversion experiences of their own. This spirit of popular religious reform capitalized on the ever-increasing number of newspapers to spread their message, attacking the professional clergy, the hierarchical clergy, with biting sarcasm in print, earthy humor, common sense reasoning. As one congregational minister wrote in 1817, religious reformers were spreading their message with, quote, ridicule, sneer, malignant sarcasm, and reproach. Who can refute a sneer? It's an excellent question. The most successful religious denomination on the frontier in this Second Great Awakening period were the Methodists. With fewer than 70,000 members in 1800, by 1844 they had become America's largest Protestant denomination, claiming over 1 million members. And again, along the lines of what I'm saying here, in contrast to New England Congregationalists, Methodists emphasized that religion was more a matter of the heart than the head. And rather than having a settled ministry where individual clergymen were tied to fixed parishes, Methodists preferred itinerant circuit riders, often young unmarried men who were on horseback and went from place to place, preaching in houses or open fields or wherever people gathered to listen. So we've got the Second Great Awakening spreading from the east to the west. By the 1820s, revivalism is reaching a peak of emotion in an area of central and western New York known as the Burned Over District, because the flames of religious revivalism swept through that area. And here's a moment when a lot of the things I'm talking about in this lecture come together. The recent completion of the Erie Canal made this burned over district a magnet for people looking to promote their fortunes, to get ahead. So you have an unsettled population there with high expectations. The man who harnessed these anxieties to religion was Charles Grandison Finney, who started out as a lawyer, but had his own religious conversion experience that put him on the road as a Presbyterian minister. And his greatest revival took place in Rochester, New York in 1830. In many ways, he can be seen as the father of modern revivalism, and his Rochester revival shows why, because he created a massive revival in which all denominations participated. He also introduced something new for speeding conversions along. He had to get efficient with getting people to convert. He created something called the anxious bench, a bench that was out in the open where people who were ready for conversion were seated so they could be seen by everyone, they could feel the eyes of everyone and the prayers of everyone, and hopefully experience a conversion experience under the impulse of that intense group focus, and then encourage more people to do the same. Now, these revivals, these Second Great Awakening revivals, were something very different from what came before, even in the realm of Great Awakenings. Revivalists in the 18th century during the First Great Awakening portrayed revivals as the miraculous work of God. Finney said, oh, no, these are human creations. The divine spirit may be flowing in revivals, but people made these revivals and conversions happen. Finney also rejected the whole idea that people had a natural desire to sin, that people by nature were depraved. No one had to sin, he declared. People could will themselves out of sin in the same way that they willed themselves into it. And again, all of these sort of phrases and words that are arising in this time period, always you sort of have an aha moment, because when you understand the root of these things, you suddenly realize where they came from. People who were moved by Finney's message began to describe themselves as being born again, their past guilt washed away. So in essence, Finney was really telling people the message they were longing to hear. He was absolutely in tune with the times. During a time of change and expectations, he told people that their destinies were in their own hands. He assured them that even in religion, people could make of themselves what they chose. These kinds of ideas, suggesting that maybe a new age was at hand and offering alternatives and a new kind of comfort, took their most extreme form in the experimental or utopian communities that flourished beginning in the 1820s. And although they varied a lot in their message and their purpose and their organization, utopian communities shared some common features. So they were all in one way or another experimental. They were all very optimistic. We have a new way of living that's going to be beyond and above this crass capitalistic chaos that we are seeing all around us. And they, in one way or another, these utopian communities were based on the idea that you could reform the entire human condition if the circumstances of how you were living were right. Their founders were often intellectuals who designed their communities as alternatives to the prevailing competitive capitalism, scary, changing, unpredictable. And they hoped that their utopian communities would be a model to the rest of society as a way to overcome, again, America's competitive economy. American interest in utopian communities first emerged in the 1820s. So in 1825, for example, British industrialist Robert Owen founded the New Harmony community in Indiana. Owen was someone who had managed cotton mills before, but by 1825, he came to the conclusion that the problems of the age were social, not political, and if society could be perfected, then vice and misery would disappear. That's very optimistic. But how could you fix society? Well, by improving individuals, Owen argued. And how could you improve individuals? He argued that environment was the key to human character. So fix the environment, the community surrounding an individual, and then you fixed the individuals as well. So in essence, the key to perfecting society, to Owen, was creating small planned communities grounded on cooperation and unity rather than commercial competition. And in fact, Truth in Advertising, he called his small planned communities, quote, villages of unity and mutual cooperation. This is what he's preaching. Now, unfortunately, within 2 years, Owen's vision failed because New Harmony attracted not only utopians and believers, but also vagrants and fanatics who were not particularly eager in working towards a common good. But just because New Harmony failed didn't mean utopianism vanished. In the 1830s, when the US economy lurched into a depression and Americans felt even more unsettled and anxious, utopianism became particularly popular. As, again, people are searching for some way to make order of things, for some way to feel better about what's happening. And a number of small utopian communities were founded in the 1830s, and intense Christianity was at the heart of many of them. So these two ways of people coping with the moment were even combined. So in a sense, these utopian communities are centers of searching, of modeling a way that the United States could go, supposedly being a better way of dealing with all that was being seen in the market revolution. Okay, a couple more things. I have a few more minutes here. I might go 2 minutes long, so hang with me, folks. It's my last chance. We've had people reaching for religion. We've had people joining utopian communities. People also reacted to the times by investing their energy into reform movements that showed the same kind of mix of idealism and hopefulness and anxiety about changes and their implications. For example, there was a health food kick in the early 19th century. There were two particularly prominent figures in this movement. One of them was the Reverend Sylvester Graham, who came up with a special diet to fight what he called carnal urges, which are just what you think they are. Graham crackers, this is where they come from, were part of this diet. So supposedly, graham crackers suppressed sexual impulses. Don't know what to do with that. I like graham crackers and never thought about that before, but a second figure in the health movement was John Harvey Kellogg, inventor of corn flakes, also intended to tame carnal impulses. And I promise you, you will never think about graham crackers and corn flakes the same way ever again. So here again with these health movements, as with religion and utopian societies, you see people taming and regimenting and reshaping things to control what would have felt like raging changes. The temperance movement grew out of some of the same influences, and it was wildly popular in this period. Given the amount of drinking, it was wildly necessary in this period. And maybe that was another response to the time. Maybe people were more addicted to alcohol. In the temperance movement, women played a major role, in part inspired by the holdover of the idea that women were in charge of social morality. And in fact, in religious movements and utopias, women also played major roles for much the same reason. Now, it's important to note that the temperance movement was not a white movement. There were many early Black organizers, and for example, the first African-American temperance organization was the New Haven Temperance Society of People of Color. I'm telling you, New Haven and Connecticut, always rising up somehow. Interestingly, even in its early years, temperance had a notable crossover with another social reform movement that began to boom in this period, abolitionism. Abolitionist societies sometimes had a strong temperance wing attached to them, and some abolition societies refused membership to people who drank. Now, it's also important to note, and yes, I guess there is a little slide coming up here. I saw Carl walking over there. Now, it's important to note that there were active anti-slavery efforts in the earlier years of the early republic, but the abolitionist movement really kicked into high gear when it began using the postal system around 1831, which was also spreading and growing in this period using some of the technology that I've already been talking about. Of course, the abolitionists were particularly trying to spread anti-slavery literature to the South. Like other reform societies I've talked about here, abolitionism was responding to national changes, national growth, new states, and new questions about American identity that increasingly in this period couldn't be avoided. Increasingly, national growth meant a need for setting terms. So in essence, the nation was coming into its own as a nation in this period, and in the process, it was being forced to face some really fundamental questions about its identity. And some of those questions ultimately would lead to a civil war. Now, as I wind down this lecture, a few final points. I have focused on the struggle and evolution of democracy and its place in politics among the American people and the nation, because in many ways, that is the core of the meaning of being American. Because the struggle to define democracy, to stifle it, to limit it, to defend it, to expand it, That defines the American story. At times, that struggle has deprived people of their fundamental rights, and at other times, it has enabled people to demand rights for themselves. And obviously, this is a repeating pattern, an ongoing pattern. What rights am I talking about? Democracy, the right of political representation, the power of public opinion, the accountability of office holders to those who gave them power, the right to free and fair elections, the right to protest, the right to a free press, the fundamental right to disagree. These things have been questioned and attacked many times in American history. For that reason, we need to be feelingly aware of democracy and what it is. We need to own the fact that democracy is an ongoing process that has to be appreciated and defended. It is not a given. Whatever your politics, please remember that particularly at moments like the present, you matter. Your views matter. Your energies matter. And your awareness of the history of the United States and its ideals, however much those ideals haven't been met yet, that matters. Now, hopefully this idea will inspire you to do your best for the nation, not to hang back, but to work for what you believe in, to work towards the future. In a way, my lectures have supported that idea. Here, as in all of my lecture courses, I focused on ground-level realities, real people, sometimes individuals, doing real things. And some of you have told me over the course of the last few weeks, and actually people have told me this over the course of my 27 years here at Yale, that you love the anecdotes. And obviously, I love the anecdotes, right? I love telling the anecdotes. I have an anecdote brain. But there's a broader and more important reason for telling them. History is people. It is individuals taking action or being denied the opportunity to take action. And if we understand the past that way, as a flawed, individualized human endeavor, we can take that understanding into the present and truly grasp the ways in which we matter, in which our individual actions matter. I teach in part because I see it as my attempt to give others that gift of understanding our role, our power as citizens, our place in a democratic republic. So with that gift in mind, I will close by saying, may we all live up to the moment at hand. Thank you. Thank you.